Hello, and welcome to this session, Build a Permission Set-Led Security Model. My name's Louise Lockie. Here are some details about me. I'm a Salesforce MVP, now Hall of Fame. I'm one of the organisers of London's Calling, a community conference in the UK, in London. I lead the London Women in Tech user group. I work with the Salesforce Architect team as a well-architected ambassador. I am 21 times certified, one of those being as a certified instructor. I do have a golden hoodie. I received it after receiving the Awesome Admin Award. And I absolutely love speaking about Salesforce at conferences such as Dreamforce, World Tour, TDX and user groups, but particularly the community conferences like those you can see on screen. So we're going to be talking today about moving from profiles to permission sets, why we need to be thinking about it and how we should do it. So here is the agenda. We'll touch on why we need to restrict permissions at all, why security and our data model and data access model is important. We'll talk about why we're talking about it now. Why are we thinking about changing? We'll talk about the tools that we have to help us with this change and the feature gap. We'll talk about how we should plan and how we should make this change. And then we'll move on to what's coming up and what resources we have and what my recommendation is to you all. So starting off with why do we restrict permissions at all? Well, it's what every good admin should do. Only give our users, and bear in mind that includes any integrations accessing the system, the minimum amount of access, only that they need to complete their tasks. And this doesn't relate just to Salesforce. This relates to software and permissioning overall. There's the principle of least privilege, which is a commonly known phrase and way of applying permissions. And that originates with this quote: every program and every privileged user of the system should operate using the least amount of privilege necessary to complete the job. And this isn't about us admins being tight with the access. It relates to things like data loss and IP loss. So if we give our users and maybe our integrations too much access, well, we could leave ourselves vulnerable to loss of our data and loss of our intellectual property. So of course we have that to consider, but we also have our users to consider and their user experience. If we give every user access to every record and to every field, then one, their page layouts will be way too complex and they will end up scrolling for way too long to get to where they need to go. It is detrimental to the user experience, but also if they can really see all of the data in the org, well, then that makes it a bit harder to see the records and find the records that they do need to access. So it really is best practice all round. But I'm sure you're all convinced of that already. So let's move on to why we're looking at changing how we do this. Why do we need to change? So we're talking today about moving from a profile-led permissions model. So potentially today you are giving out most of your permissions via a profile, hopefully with a combination of some permission sets as well. And what we're advocating today is moving away from that so that our permissions sit solely on permission sets. So these are the key reasons why we should do so. So number one is quite a compelling reason in that Salesforce have announced that permissions on profiles will be sunset for the Spring 26 release. So though that is in the future, that still means we need to start planning, and we've been forewarned, so we can start to do that. The second reason is even before it was announced that permissions on profiles would be sunset, it was already best practice and recommended by Salesforce and the awesome admin team and the PMs behind that area that using permission sets to grant permissions was best practice. The third reason here is that because of this transition and because Salesforce is slightly forcing it by moving permissions off of profiles, of course they're going to help us with that. And so we have new features, some already available and some on the roadmap and some in beta, that are going to make the task and the transition easier. So another reason why we should be embracing it. The next one is that, in line with number two, that it's recommended as best practice, permission sets do allow for granular tailored access. Because permission sets are many to many, it means that we really can make them quite granular. Whereas obviously profiles are not, each user can only have one profile. That would sort of deter us potentially from giving out the really granular tailored access. I truly believe that maintaining profiles is less transparent. If you're giving out all of your permissions on a profile, then there's simply nowhere to document that. You're not in the system itself. The description field isn't long enough, and it's not realistic that it's being maintained. Whereas permission sets, if you're giving out a new permission set for each set of permissions, permissions that are logically grouped together, then you can really name it well and use the description field well, and it should be a lot easier for your future self or your successors to come in and see what has been granted. Now let's think about the limitations of profiles. There is only one per user, as I've just mentioned. They are tied to license type. So when you give out or create rather a profile, it is tied to a license type. A permission set can be, but doesn't have to be. They naturally encourage us to grant more than the required access, because in too many times it's just easy if you have half of a team who need one more area of the system that they've got access to, you can go into the profile and just grant them access. And yes, you've granted all of the team access, but you've met your requirement. But of course you haven't. You've gone beyond that, and therefore you've given out more access than you should have done. And that profiles does encourage that, because it's just easier sometimes. And I very much hope that we're all using permission sets as part of our model at the moment anyway. And so by shifting from profiles to permission sets as the focus and the driver, this is a shift rather than a complete change. So we're just extending the use of permission sets as they are removed from profiles, and so it really isn't a complete change. Okay, convinced. So let's talk a bit about profiles. Now, I've talked about moving from profiles to permission sets. So does that mean they're going away? Well, no, but their role is changing. As I mentioned at the beginning, the permissions part of profiles is going to be sunset. They're not going to be on profiles anymore. But profiles themselves will remain, and I'll talk a bit more about what that means. So to compare profiles and permission sets today, if we look at the top half of the the setup for profiles and permission sets, which are called apps and app permissions, which is normally what users can see. We can see, if you do a quick dedupe, that those two are the same. Okay, so anything we can grant on profiles at the moment in the app section, we can already grant in permission sets. Okay, so that's not what's changing. Then let's look at the system permissions, what they can do. And here is where we've got the difference. So on the left we have the profiles, and on the right we have the permission sets. So you can see this is where profiles will remain, because this is where there are some areas that cannot move to permission sets. Okay, so let's dig into that and look at the gap analysis. So what stays on profile? And I've put here for now, because we just don't know what's coming. I certainly don't fully. I'm an independent consultant. I don't work for Salesforce, so I can only guess at some of this. But what do we know? Let's focus on what we know. Well, we know what's staying on profiles for now are login hours and login IP ranges. Okay, they will continue to sit on profile. So if you're using them at the moment, think about how you're using them. I myself find them that they do have some limitations. One of those being that login hours, for example, uses the login hours of the account, the org. So if you're trying to use those for team members in different time zones, there's already a bit of an issue with those. What else is staying on profile? Well, we've got password policies and we've got system settings. So again, thinking back to that last slide where we combined the two, this is what sat under those system permissions that isn't on permission set at the moment. So then we get into the sort of the areas where we do, I think, need to give some consideration to. And that's default record types, page layout assignments, and app page assignments. And just to give you an example of one of those, of course, there we have the activating a app page, and you can choose to do it by profile as well as app and record type. Okay, so that's what I mean by that last one. Now let's think about the bottom three, and I've put asterisks there because I believe other options already exist. We just have to think a bit differently. So first of all, the first one there, default record types. Now, of course, permission sets can't grant a default. And the reason they can't grant a default is because they are many-to-many. So I, as a user, could have 4 different permission sets, each granting me a default account record type. How would the system know? It would have to arbitrarily pick one of them, so it would be redundant. Okay, so they naturally aren't moving to permission sets. But let's think about record types overall. And I think this is a good opportunity as us admins to think about where we're using these tools and whether we still need to use them in the same way, because the Salesforce that we're working with today is undoubtedly different to the Salesforce we worked with when we set up those record types. So a few things to think about is what are your use cases for record types? If we think back to what record types do, they principally grant us the ability to display different page layouts and different pick list values. Now, page layouts, of course, with dynamic forms, we can do that. We can meet that requirement from record types already. So if that's your main driver for record types, then maybe you don't need record types in the same way that you used to. Pick list values, still a use case for them there. Again, let's watch this space and see what happens in the future. But just thinking about that there. The other thing with default record types is that a user can go in themselves and set their default. So yes, I can hear you all saying my users won't do that, but it is technically an option. Okay, so think about how you're using record types. Page layout assignments, I probably already hinted at the solution for that. With dynamic forms now, do we really need page layout assignments by profile? Because we could use dynamic forms and make those different field sections conditional and so forth. So there is already a technical solution there for sure. And of course, do we do that via record type? I don't know. The last one there is app page, and I think this not only isn't so much a challenge here because in all honesty, I don't know when I've used this here. I've always normally made it by app or org default. But in order to do this, remember we can grant access to apps via permission sets. So if we have different app pages, we don't have to do them by profile. We can assign them to an app and then assign those apps via permission sets. So I don't see that as a big challenge at all. So I think we really are just looking at default record types. One thing to consider with moving to allocating more to apps, having different apps and granting access that way, is that remember an app comes with a home page. So that can be a really nice way of differentiating between different personas, different departments maybe. Give them their own app with the different tab layouts, that maybe a couple of custom tabs with dashboards on them, something like that. So yeah, that can be quite a nice option, full stop. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. So this is what we're really thinking about when we want to make the move to remove permissions from our profiles and think about what our new profile setup will look like, because that's what I encourage everyone to do, to use this as an opportunity to think about their setup. Okay, so let's just have a quick recap. What has changed of late that maybe gave us an indication that this was all coming? What features have we got? Well, for one, we've got permission set groups. Now, I've put here saving admin clicks since 2019. And I put that there because I have to be honest with you. When permission set groups came out, I was sort of, okay, I can see they could be useful, but it's just saving me clicks. I'm not sure how useful. Of course, now with the change and the move away from permissions on profiles, I can really see how permission set groups are part of the bigger picture that Salesforce had in mind, I'm sure, and are really going to help us. So permission set groups enable us to group permission sets together, as the name would indicate. But remember, each of those permission sets can also be allocated on their own, and they can be in multiple permission set groups. So it really just enables us to create reusable permission sets, but then group them together where we commonly grant out access. We'll talk more about that shortly. Okay, the other feature that has come in is the muting permission set, or muting permission set within a group. Now remember with this, it is not a deny permission. Some of you may work with systems such as Marketing Cloud, in fact, that does have deny permissions. This is not a deny permission. What it is the ability to mute a permission within a permission set group. So if you are granting a permission in a permission set group, and maybe you're reusing a permission set, you can use it in one group to give all of the permissions out, and then in another group to have a mute. That means you don't have to create a new permission set. You can reuse the same one, but part of it is muted. And again, I'll show you an example of that a bit later on, but just a reminder, that feature's been around for a while. You may or may not be using it. What else has come along? Well, we now have the ability to set an expiry date when we are granting permission sets and permission set groups. It's a newish feature, not incredibly new, but in the last few releases. Okay, so this is if you are granting someone access because they're working on a certain project, they're helping out a different department for a period of time, for example, then you can grant them the permission set for that period of time. So you don't have to remember to come back in and remove it at the end. Say someone's on a project to tidy up and merge some accounts. You don't want them to have the delete account permission permanently, but you don't want to have to remember to take it off them at the end of the project. You can use that feature there. Okay, so that's under user management settings. And there are a few other new ones as well that I'm covering in the roadmap area because they are newer. Okay, so for now, let's move and talk about how I recommend you use this opportunity to move to a permission set led security model. So of course my recommended approach is to have fewer profiles and more permission sets, and of course to utilize groups. So in this world, what's my recommendation? My recommendation for profiles is to go pretty low. How many do we need? How low can we go? So here you can see that I've got 3 profiles. And I'll talk about each of these a bit more in a moment. So I've got the system admin profile. Obviously, we need someone who has the keys to the system that can get in anywhere and do everything. Then my proposal is that we have a baseline profile. It's a custom profile, and that's the one we're granting to hopefully nearly all of our other users. And then I've got here that we do need an integration profile. So for our integrations, we will need a very empty profile to use for our APIs and so forth. And I've crossed out custom there because actually now that does come out of the box, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But of course, if you do utilize other license types, you won't be able to stick to just those 3. For example, if you combine different license types, such as having platform users, then they will need a profile. Community users the same. And I've got here chatter only users. I'm still a big fan of chatter in the system. Okay, so leaving that aside, that of course would increase the number. But let's look at the main 3 that I'm recommending. See if you can get down to those main 3. So I think we've already talked about the system administrator. You can either use the standard system admin profile, or you can build out a custom one. We know that having modify all data is pretty much makes an admin, but that needs to stay. So that stays. The second is the API or integration profile. So this is where we would have a dedicated profile for our different integrations. And here we can use the new free API license and profile that Salesforce granted to us in March or April 2023. At TDX 2023, it was announced that all users, maybe tied to a certain org level, I can't quite remember, will have 5 API licenses free of charge. And this was to encourage us to not reuse one paid license for multiple integrations, which businesses did quite often because they didn't want to have to pay the extra licenses. So now we have 5 for free. If you're not familiar with them, use this, make a note and go and investigate. So what would we do with them? Well, we would set the password policy, which would normally be password never expires for an integration, just to make life easier. And then you wouldn't customize any further because you would use permission sets to grant only the access each integration requires. Okay, so one profile for integrations with just the password policy on it, and then you would give that out to each of your integration users, bearing in mind you've now got 5 for free, and then each of those integration users would have their own permission sets that grant them only the access they need for their integration, which of course will be different one by one. And here, in case you haven't seen it, there's the user license of Salesforce integration that we now get for free and the profile that came with it. Okay, so that's our second profile. And then this is the important one here. We've got the third one. We would create a new custom profile that is our baseline company profile. And we would clone the minimum access Salesforce profile that's there at the moment. Please be mindful that it may not be as empty as you think it is, just because of the way we've been able to create new fields and add them to all profiles, and it's encouraged us to do so. So just give it a bit of a tidy up first. But you clone that profile. You would set the password policies and the system settings. Okay, so they would normally be fairly generic across your company anyway. If you needed them, you would set your IP ranges and your login hours. Okay, so these are the 4 things that stay on profile. And then if they apply to all users, you could use your profile for your default record type and your page layout assignments. But bearing in mind what I've just talked about those 2, the asterisks still apply. But you could roll out a default to everyone and then enable them to, in the first case, change their own. Okay, so that's the profiles. Let's live in that world where we have the system admin profile, our integration's got a profile, but then all of our users are using one pretty much empty profile. So what happens next? Well, then we use permission sets. Okay, so we would use permission sets to grant our access. And let's think about, first of all, some of the baseline access we might grant out. So maybe we have a permission set that's called Core Universal Object Permissions. So this is just going to be your core objects that you use at your company that are universal, and you can then grant those access in one permission set. So let's say we've got sorry. Let's say we've got create, read, and edit account, create, read, and edit contact, read lead, and read opportunity. Let's say read case. And let's say that's the baseline for all your users in the company. So you can have those as your core universal object permissions. Obviously, you're using other objects, but they would be in other permission sets because they're not universal across your whole company. Then you could have another permission set for core universal access. So this would be the Visualforce page access that you may be using, your Apex class access that you may be using, your flow access levels, where you're granting flow, your custom metadata type access. And again, this I envisage being universal. These are the parts of the system that everyone uses and you need to keep running the system. What about system permissions then? So again, core universal system permissions. What does everyone have the ability to do? So in this case, it might be run reports, transfer records, send email, view dashboards in public folders. Okay, so just a selection of what they could be, but think of the ones that everyone is going to have and put those in one permission set. Then next, another idea for a baseline permission set is delete access. So maybe we've got delete on opportunity, account, lead, and invoice. That's a new object, isn't it? But we've got that there. And we would say here, granted very sparingly. So that's not a universal one, as you can see. So that's granting baseline access, not really related to role or persona or department. But let's talk about department now. So this could be, again, like a persona as well. So what about sales users? So you could have a permission set that, one, grants them access to the sales app. So remember that controls a lot of the pages as well. It's got CRE on lead, because they need to be able to create and edit as well as read that they got from the universal. The same for opportunity. They need to be able to send list emails, and that's all sales users. What about marketing users? Well, the same, they get their own app. They get CRE on lead as well, and on campaign, and they can mass email. So what I'm showing you here is we're granting some apps, we're granting some object access, but also some permissions here. So then finance. We've got CRE on invoice, on contract, and maybe you've got some field level security on some additional fields. There's a credit card number field that only finance can access, so we put that on that permission set. And finally on this screen, exec users. They would have read on invoice, on contract, they get to schedule reports. So you can see again a mixture of object access and system permissions. Another way to group your permissions in permission sets is feature-based. So I mentioned earlier that I still enjoy the functionality of chatter in some orgs. So let's say we have a permission set that includes create and own new chatter groups. It includes moderate chatter. It includes the ability to manage unlisted groups and to invite customers to chatter. So essentially, this is for a chatter moderator. What about manage user access? So manage users, reset users' passwords and unlock users. That's another permission. Assign permission sets. Then what about features? So say you've got sales enablement, what used to be called My Trailhead in your org. You could use a permission set to grant out the access for the moderators of that. So to manage prompts, to manage learning reporting. So these are around features. And then last one I've got on screen here, reporting permissions. So those people with extended access to reports, so they can export reports, they can create the folders, they can manage the custom report types. Okay, so there's some ideas of 3 different ways of grouping permissions into permission sets. So think about how the different access levels are required, or how they're given out and what's required in your org at the moment, and how you could maybe group them into permission sets a bit like I've done here. But of course we also want to use groups. So remember, the joy of permission set groups is that you can reuse permission sets. So one permission set can be in multiple groups as well as being granted out individually. So let's look at this example. So this would be the baseline company user permission set group. So as soon as you have a new user coming on board, they are all going to get this permission set group because it's the baseline. So that uses the shared system permissions, the shared access, and the object permissions. Okay, so even though you may have looked at that first screen where I had those different ones there and said, well, that means everyone gets all of them. They do, yes, but in a group. So one click. Remember, they're saving those clicks. Here's another one. We've got the super user permission set group. So on top of the baseline and on top of their department permission sets, they maybe get a permission set group because they're a super user. And that includes in it the reporting permissions, the one with the managing report types, exporting reports, the delete permission set, and the manage users, because they're our super users. So then using permission set groups to group the commonly applied permission sets into personas. So here I've got a persona of a user and learning management persona. So they would have the manage users permission set, the sales enablement, remember the managing the prompts and the my trailhead parts of the system, and the chatter moderator. Okay. And there's another one. What about a sales operations persona? This is their permission set group. They get the sales user permission set, they get the sales enablement permission set, they get the delete access permission set, and they get the reporting permission set. So here you can see more how that we reuse the different permission sets. And then let's talk about bringing it together, because that's what this is all about. And it is a building block approach. So in my scenario here, we would start with the custom baseline profile that's pretty much empty. It's got our password policies, our IP range, and our system settings in it. We would add that baseline permission set group of our universal different settings that may have been on the profile before, but now they're easily identified, they're easily ring-fenced and allocated as different permission sets in one permission set group. We would add potentially the required department permission sets, and I do put plural there because of course someone could be essentially working the role of different departments or need different departments permission sets, and they can be added on that granular level. Maybe they are a chatter moderator or or they need more reporting functionality, then they can get a feature permission set. And you add that all together here. Okay. So here what we've got is I've got a profile, I've got a permission set group, and I've got a permission set. So this is quite a basic option here, but you can see how the building block comes into it. And remember the mute that I talked about earlier. Okay, remember it only mutes within the same permission set group, but here's an example of a permission set group for sales ops. And then here we've got one for sales managers. So sales managers need more access than the sales team, but not as much as the sales ops. So we are giving them the sales user permission set, we're giving them sales enablement, we are giving them the delete permission set, but we don't want them to be able to delete everything that sales ops do. So we're giving them the mute for delete opportunity. And what that means is that one part of delete has been removed. Okay, so I've reused this, I've cloned this, and then just added a mute. It really gives me a lot more flexibility, a lot more transparency, and encourages me to give the right access. Okay, so that's my building block approach. So what's on the roadmap? So getting to feature parity, that's what's next. So let me show you a few of the ideas that have come into fruition or are coming to fruition that will help us on the way here. Okay, so the first one is now available. Okay, so this is a fantastic, to my mind, feature that you can toggle it on. Let me show you here. In your user management settings in setup, you can change the field level security for permission sets for during field creation. It's no longer beta, in fact, it's now generally available. And that, once you enable it, means that when you create a new field, instead of showing you all the profiles and them already being pre-ticked, encouraging us on our lazy days to give that new field to all of our profiles, including our integration ones, including our minimum access. Instead of that, it will surface just those permission sets that have got read access to the object in question. Now you can toggle on further and see all of your permission sets, but it's a really great feature. And what's more, nothing is pre-ticked, so it really makes us think about who are we giving this access to. Okay, so when we create a new field, that's what this is. So this means this here that I've hated for a long time has now disappeared. Well, it can disappear. We have the control to make it disappear. Okay, so that's the great thing, and that is fairly new still, but it is now available. Okay, the next one that is also now available is that another feature gap was that org-wide email addresses you assigned by profile or to everyone. Now we can assign them in permission sets. Okay, so that's another gap that's been filled. Now, when it comes to some of the other areas, I'm just sharing with you here some of the updates and ideas on the Idea Exchange so that you can see the status of them. Okay, so default record type by assignment. I'll just click on the bigger to get the update. And the update here is that the experience is being improved. So the default record type is staying on profiles for now, or maybe it's staying on it for good, in fact. But when you create or edit a record type, we will now be able to set which permission sets it's available for. So we can grant the record types more easily by permission set. Okay. And they'll also make a way of making it easier to change them. They'll also make it easier to make it clear where this is the default, because as I mentioned before, it's going to be nigh on impossible to move this to permission sets, just the nature of the relationship, the many to many, and so keeping the default on profiles is where we stand. Okay, the next one on page layouts assignments. So this is again an area that is at the moment staying on profiles, as it's a bit of a tricky one. They are going to stay on profiles because we're thinking that dynamic forms are the way forward. Well, I certainly am. So do you consider dynamic forms when thinking about your page layouts, because it looks like they're not going to get much more love because the way forward is dynamic forms. And the update here is that they're also looking at the ability to filter dynamic forms based on permission set or permission set group assignment. So really to bring that in line with the rest of what we've talked about today. Okay, so there's some items that are still being looked into, but more and more have already been moved to GA, generally available. And what else then will help us? What are the tools and resources? Well, we now have user access policies. And user access policies are now in open beta. So what that means is they're not yet GA, so things could still change, but you don't need to request access to them. You can turn them on yourself in setup. And user access policies will enable us to automate some of our allocating of permission sets, permission set groups, permission set licenses. You can see here on my screen, groups and queues. So essentially what you can do is you can say if these users meet this criteria, and you can build it out. So maybe they're their license type, maybe their role, maybe their department, the fields that you have available to you, and then you can automate the granting of permission sets, permission set groups, access to a queue, and so forth. So yes, you may have looked at my building block approach and said, well, that's going to take longer to allocate than just a simple profile, but not with user access policies. That will help us automate this process, which is great because they can grant and revoke access. We can use the tool to mass migrate user access. So again, as you're transitioning, this will help you. And you can use it to track permission changes. You really have a good idea of why someone's access has changed and how. Okay. The next tool that's available is the User Access and Permissions Assistant app. And if you haven't looked at that recently, look at it again because it's had a couple of different facelifts and enhancements now. So have a look at it to be able to analyze what your users can see and do, what your permissions, where they're granted, and what your permission sets and permission sets groups can see and do. Okay. You can also use it to convert profiles to permission sets. There is a chatter group that you can access to stay on top of these new enhancements. It's called the Future of User Access Management. There's also a lot of other content been coming out over the last couple of years, more since then, in fact, about this area. So lots of resources available. So what are my recommendations? What are the next steps you should be taking? Well, there is no time like the present. So audit your profiles. How many do you have? How many are similar? How many are granting out which access? Do an audit. You can use some tools to do that. Do the same for your permission sets. Turn on user access policies in setup. Now it's open beta, and use that. Also install the User Access and Permissions Assistant app because these two will help with the first two. Review your results. Question those anomalies. You know, if something doesn't look right, we'll wonder why. Could have been because 5 years ago someone needed a permission and it's been granted to their whole profile. Plan your new setup. Use this as an opportunity to rethink your security model. What does each group of users need? Think in personas. Don't just lift and shift. You can just lift and shift. The tools that I've mentioned here will help you do that if that's what it comes to. But yes, you'll meet the deadline of spring 26, but you'll still be none the wiser whether you're granting the right permissions to the right people. Work in a sandbox, of course. Test it. Deploy it. And you'll be good to go. And of course, it's something that will keep needing refining as permissions change, as Salesforce makes changes, as your company changes. Okay, so some of the areas that I've shown today are available in this set of resources. Here I list those idea exchange ideas. So you can see the updates on there. You could follow them. I give you access and information about the user access policies and the app, as well as the chatter group and some of the admin resources. So with that, I say thank you.
Thank you for watching. We would love to get your opinion on this content, so please leave us some feedback on the comment section below. If you did like this content, give that like button a tap, and of course, if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to the Salesforce Admins YouTube channel. If you want to learn more about being a Salesforce admin in general, head on over to admin.salesforce.com. Thanks again.